Queen Matilda of Flanders, overshadowed by her more famous granddaughter of the same name, was atypical for a woman of her time. She had immense sway, refusing to be cowed by her often violent Norman husband. She was more than just the wife of the conqueror. She was one of the most influential and powerful women in Europe. And this is her story. Following her husband's victory at the Battle of Hastings, Matilda was now Queen of England, a country she had not yet set foot in. She is currently still in Normandy, acting as regent there, and during William's absence there had been constant squabbling, as one count found treachery in another, and no duke to rein them in. So it was up to Matilda to knock heads together, travelling from city to city, making sure her domain, after all she's regent, is not devolving into civil war. Through political guile and wits, she has managed to keep peace in the kingdom. For the most part, this alone is testament to her ability to rule, and she has certainly earned the respect of her subjects. Unfortunately for her, Matilda wasn't present for William's coronation. But ever since she'd first heard of her husband's victory over in England, the ambitious Matilda had been stylising herself as queen. Politically, the high-born duchess had reached the very top. Nothing was higher than this. She had been gifted with vast lands in England, including Surrey, Hampshire, Wiltshire, as well as Dorset and Cornwall, among others. She was easily the most richest woman in the kingdom. She was even entitled to Queen Gold, which was 1/10 of every fine paid to the crown. She's staggeringly rich. The City of London also paid their tolls in lamp oil and wood, and Norfolk would supply her a new palfrey horse every year. So you can imagine that Matilda was chomping at the bit to visit her new kingdom. But she would have to wait, as a couple of factors needed to be sorted out first. Right. William wanted to crown her as queen. However, he was determined that her coronation would fare better than his own. Now, William himself was crowned at Christmas Day in 1066, and what should have been a great day ended in disaster. The local populace were already far from overjoyed at a foreign invader crowning himself king. So when some people did declare the affirmation, it was quite loud, and the Normans thought there was an uprising, so conducted a massacre. Right. Most of the congregation, Saxon and Norman, fled, so only a gaggle of bigwigs were left to finish the ceremony. Not good. It was a dark day for William. So he needed to be careful when it came down to Matilda's own coronation. And the Queen's coronation wouldn't be without its own controversies, as the Saxon nobility, who were still the majority in the kingdom, opposed the crowning of a queen. In their culture, the nobility didn't gratify their wives with such titles. It just wasn't done. I mean, you had queens, but they didn't get their own coronation. But as William was in charge now, things would be different, he insisted. The way he puts it is, Matilda was a great stateswoman and would make a great queen, and queens need a coronation. But this would be no quick process. In fact, it would take 2 years for Matilda to finally arrive in England for the big ceremony. And to be crowned, Matilda would have to cross the Channel and head to Westminster Abbey for the coronation. Now, a possible reason for the delay may have been that the kingdom was far from stable. The revolt by Edgar Atheling had only just been put down. The north of England was still far from subdued. They were showing nothing but contempt for the new Norman overlords. However, unlike William, who was a soldier through and through, Matilda was an outstanding politician. She ran the Norman propaganda machine, the perfect spin doctor. If anyone would be able to sway public opinion in favour of William, it would be Matilda. He needed her in England more than ever. Most likely the factor that was preventing her travelling across the Channel to England was her pregnancy, as she was most definitely with child during the invasion and the ongoing conquest, meaning she was conducting her duties as regent while expecting a baby. And the baby was most likely born in 1067 and would be a girl called Adela, named after her grandmother. Politically, this was a good move on behalf of Matilda, as her mother Adela was the daughter of a previous king of France, Robert II, of the Capetian dynasty. This link to the French royal lineage was solidifying the royal blood of William's own line. Gone was Guillaume de Bethard. In was William the Conqueror, King of England, whose wife and children were descended from a long line of royals. And William would need all this propaganda more than ever. He knew full well that the last people that successfully invaded England were the Danes, and they were driven out within 30 years. He was going to have to make sure the Normans were here to stay, and he would need every advantage. William was brutal and merciless to the natives, butchering all dissent and erecting castles up and down the country, stamping his presence for all to see. The old Saxon nobility only seemed to oppose him, and over time would be replaced by loyal Normans. And William's inner circle was already made up of his best friends, people like Roger Montgomery and Bishop Odo. It would have felt to the natives of the Isle that the invaders were simply dividing up the spoils of war. The only common ground between the Normans and the Saxons was religion. But even here, the Normans were making their presence known. The Romanesque style of the continent is soon making its way across Britain. Still, the Normans weren't here to eradicate the Saxon ways. William himself, even though he despised the natives, respected that they had a good political system that was more advanced than what the Normans were using. They had the Witan. The Witan was a select advisory council of the secular and ecclesiastical elite. In William's eyes, it was sophisticated and it worked. So William kept it, adopted it, renamed it the Curia Regis. It also gave the natives familiar ground. And he would have kept much of the old Witan if they hadn't have been so rebellious. Plus, many had died in the Battle of Hastings and simply needed replacing. So picture this. The system may look Norman with the styles and the people. It may sound Norman with the language, but it's pretty much the old Saxon system, the Witan, at least to begin with. Hence you have earls and sheriffs, titles that are with us today, recognised long before the Norman invasion. Whereas if you hopped over to the continent, Normandy and France, you have counts, viscounts, other positions. It's a different system altogether. So William wasn't there to replace, but to join. Even so, the Saxons were rapidly excluded from running anything political. More and more, this would have felt like an occupation by a foreign usurper, and Matilda was no stranger to the sharing of the spoils of this conquered land. Even when given lavish gifts from the church, she deemed them inadequate, demanding more. She still hasn't set foot in England yet. She's doing all this for Normandy. That's power. But propaganda can swing both ways, as enemies of Matilda and William were not idle. Hear this tale, but I will warn that there is no real evidence to its truth. It's most likely fabrication, mere rumour. Though, like always, history is murky, and for all we know, there could be no smoke without fire. Right. In the spring of 1067, William did return to Normandy briefly to oversee things, and no doubt glad that his wife had kept the domain in order during his absence. Though his good temper didn't last that long, and the wrath he had visited on the Saxons was not spared for Matilda. Grimald de Plis was a knight who had remained in Normandy for the duration of the conquest, according to these tales, and he had some news that he thinks William should be aware of. News that his wife Matilda had been unfaithful, as she was sleeping with another man while he was away. You can imagine how William took this news. Instead of questioning her about it, he stormed up to her bedchamber, dragged her into the streets, stripped her naked, and tied her hair to a horse's tail, parading her across town. At one point, the naked and shamed Matilda came to a road. Noticing that the people gathered simply did not care one jot about the abuse, as she renamed the street Rue Froide, at least I think that's how it's pronounced, for their cold attitude in the situation. Once this was done, she was slung in a dungeon, hopefully finally given clothes, and only once she had convinced William that she was innocent did he finally release her. And once her humiliation was over, she erected a cross where the ordeal began. The Croix Pleureux, the Weeping Cross. Again, I hope that's how it's pronounced. My French isn't all that great. This is a monument that unfortunately did not survive the centuries. As for Grimald de Plis, who was now deemed a liar, whose words had visited humiliation on the Queen of England, William had him hunted all over Normandy, and when he was found, he was skinned alive. 4 limbs tied to 4 horses, he was quartered. A terrible fate. But as I said at the beginning of this, did it actually happen? For a start, there's questions around Grimald, because there was a rebel who fought against William, but that was at the Battle of Velladun, where William crushed his cousin, Guy of Burgundy, about 20 years ago. Since then, Grimald had been slung in prison in Rouen, and he died. Highly doubtful that he knows all the gossip of Matilda of Flanders from his prison cell where he died years ago, casting heavy doubts over the story. It might also explain why there is no record of the road's name having been changed, nor any record of the monument. And it is strikingly similar to the story of Lady Godiva, who was paraded naked on a horse through the streets of Coventry, an event contemporary to this period in time. So it just goes to show the level of propaganda during these times, as William's enemies were not idle and bent on discrediting his name, and by extension Matilda's. But like I said, we do not know if there's any truth to the matter. There might be no smoke without fire. Like always, history is murky, and when William assaulted his wife on being turned down on a marriage, again, there was some truth to the matter. Here we just don't know. But we do know that William was in Normandy during this time, though only briefly, before hopping back over to the Channel to sort out his kingdom in England. But William was certainly in Normandy during the spring, and he is celebrating his victory over the Saxons at an Easter court in Faucon. Here, everyone worth their salt is invited, from magnates to clergy, and they have a lot to celebrate, as William, Duke of Normandy, is no longer a mere vassal of the French king, but a king in his own right. Given he was in England with his army, it is more likely that Matilda organised the celebrations during this massive event. After all, she is regent, plus it is expected of her, as wife and consort, to conduct these things, and boy did she go to town. Matilda had a dress made, for her and William, of the highest quality cloth, with gold thread, priceless. And she only drank from goblets made of gold and silver. Well, aside from the oxen horns, that is. They are given a mention in the chronicles. Even some French nobles were there, celebrating this magnificent win. The whole duchy was in high spirits as the news spread through the land. Though, unlike my wedding, they didn't have breakdancing monks. And boy, the feasts. There were many, and lavish. The likes no one had seen since the days of old. New churches were consecrated the next month in May, 1067, the spectacular continuing all the way through the spring. Matilda's new position as queen meant that she could elevate potential suitors for her daughters in the hand of marriage. No mere lords, but the sons of kings, or kings themselves, one particular king being Alfonso, the king of Leon and Castile. The middle son in a family who were sons of the great King Ferdinand, ruler of a vast Spanish empire. Ferdinand had died recently, 1065, leaving his sons with fragments of his kingdom. Alfonso was called El Bravo, a valiant hero of the region. He had his sights set on Adeliza, Matilda's eldest daughter. This is the woman who was once betrothed to Harold Godwinson, though she vowed to never marry. She turns Alfonso down. She apparently joined a convent in protest. Talks between the Spanish king and William do continue, and what William wanted, William got. So the marriage would go ahead, no matter what his daughter thought, no matter how much she protested. Yet, history says this marriage never happened. No one really knows why. Some say Adeliza died around this time, just before the wedding, on her way to this foreign land. Others say negotiations broke down. We just don't know. Whatever the case, history is up to its murky self, and the fog of time up to no good. Especially when it comes down to Oderic claiming that one of Matilda's daughters was marrying Edwin of Mercia, from the Edwin and Morcar fame. He's in charge of the north. But clearly nothing came of this, because we know who married who with the daughters, and we know that the eldest daughter is an abbess in Caen. Thus, Adeliza fades into the murky depths of history, her fate unknown. As autumn fell upon the land of Flanders, Matilda's father, Baldwin V, passed away. As she was overwhelmed by grief at the news. Although Matilda hadn't really seen much of a family since the wedding, if at all, she had still kept in contact over the years. And Baldwin wasn't considered old at 55. But the mortality rate wasn't driven by age alone. Most people still died around 50. Here, we don't have any idea how he died, but he was the only one keeping France and Normandy from squabbling, due to his relations with the French royal family. Now he's gone, anything could happen. Not that William cared much. His eyes were back on England. There was growing dissent with the native Saxons, and the two men that were in charge of things, William Fitz-Osbern and Bishop Odo, were struggling to keep things in order. So, as winter loomed on the horizon, William sailed his fleet back over to England to sort the problem out. Previously, Roger Montgomery had advised Matilda during her regency, and now he accompanies William when he sailed over the Channel, giving her more control than ever in Normandy. Though this would not last long, as her husband would soon crush the rebellion in England. And by early 1068, plans were set for Matilda to finally journey to London for her promised coronation. The title of regent now belonged to her son, Robert of Normandy. Though this would be temporary because Matilda was not gone for good and would act as regent whenever William was away in Normandy. Around Easter, 1068, Matilda arrived in England for the first time in her life. With her was a great retinue of ladies and maidens. There was a gaggle of clergy, including a physician and a chaplain, plus her second son, Richard, who was in his early teens. All this was no doubt protected by a great host as she crossed the unfamiliar territory towards her destiny. The Saxon nobility didn't quite know what to make of her, as the Normans treated her like a sovereign in her own right, as opposed to simply being the wife of the king. If the Saxons were expecting a humble woman to arrive, they would soon understand their error of judgment. Because Matilda carried great prestige, touring her new kingdom and making her presence felt. And she no doubt met up with William at Winchester while they prepared the upcoming coronation. Matilda was also pregnant again, most likely conceived when William came over last time, with her 8th child. And this child, a boy named Henry, was the first child of Matilda's to be born on English soil. It was almost as if they were determined to have part of their royal blood connected with this new land. And Henry would be her last child. Matilda was in her mid-30s and made sure her childbearing days were over. But, John, I hear you say, why are you showing me a picture of a king? Henry is her 9th child. He's the baby. There's Robert, Richard, and William Rufus in the way. There's more chance of Santino Marella winning the Royal Rumble. Henry's not even the spare. Oh, he'll become king one day. Trust me. He's the father of the other Matilda, the Empress Matilda of the Anarchy. He'll have a long reign of 35 years. But that is getting ahead of ourselves. So, back to 1068 and this Matilda. At Westminster, there was gold aplenty, a lavish affair. Gold robes, platters made of gold and silver, as much food as they could possibly eat. Opulent celebrations that went on until Whitsun, which, in 1068 was on the 11th of May. And this wasn't even the coronation. This was just the festivities leading up to it. The event itself was in a league of its own. William needed to win her over in the eyes of the Saxons, and it was full with pomp and circumstance. It had to be bigger and better than his, and so it was. Also remember that this is the coronation for the wife of a king, not a queen acting as sole ruler. This was unheard of. Something new was going on. Right, let's get to the actual event itself. Unlike William, Stigand, the Archbishop of Canterbury, didn't preside over this event. The Archbishop of York, Ealdred, conducted the ceremony. And the Laudis Regiae, a special hymn, was most likely written by him, specifically for Matilda. This is its first use in England. He's a Saxon, and used to the old ways, using parts of the previous system that the Saxons would be more familiar with, like the collection of hymns called the Ordo. Though, said Stigand wasn't presiding over the ceremony, he was certainly there, as were many other Saxons, including Edwin and Morcar. Dressed in gold, Matilda made her way to the high altar at Westminster Cathedral. Then she was anointed with holy oils before she was led to her throne. Once the ceremony was done, she rose, crowned Regina. Things were certainly changing with this new monarchy, and there was no doubting that she was queen. Bells rang out all over the kingdom. Naturally, this was followed by a lavish pig-out, the obligatory banquet, and I'll tell you a strange Norman tradition. A knight was given the title of champion, and he was given powers to challenge anyone who questioned the Queen's authority. In this case, the chap they chose was a knight called Marmion, a dashing young knight, riding into the banquet atop a horse and in full chain mail, with weapons as if for war. Now, we don't know if he took this seriously or it was in jest, but he immediately sets down a challenge to any man who did not recognise Matilda or William as king. Call anyone that did a liar. Now, no one accepted this challenge, and the hall rejoiced. Again, so we don't know if this was in jest, a part of the ceremony, like a fun thing to do, or something serious, but most likely this was in jest. These are the Normans. But also, these are the Normans. You know what I mean? Anyway, Matilda herself granted the title of Grande Penitière to one of her subjects. This had the task of carrying the salt and the knives to the royal table, and then serve the king and queen for the evening, and in return they'd receive the items as payment. Not too bad, eh? And actually, this became quite a prestiged position, evolving as time went on, not just at coronations but at other events. A good example being at Henry III's wedding, where Simon de Montfort would squabble with a rival until he was granted the position of serving the king and queen, basically a steward. A new dawn had risen on England. Oh, and in France, by the way, the title of Grande Penitière was taken far more seriously, and was a great office of the crown. This was basically the man in charge of the royal pantry, and holder of the royal goblet, effectively the breadmaster. He would have had around a dozen staff, complete with privileges. It was an esteemed position. And it's also where we get the word pantry, panetière. There you go. But I think it's time we dealt with some shenanigans that are going on around this time. Do you remember Brithric Mull, that dashing Saxon noble who Matilda was crushing on while in her early teens? The chap who turned her down. Yeah, she's not forgotten about him. He's been living in her head rent-free all these years. She hated him, and now she only lusted for revenge. Brithric had Tewkesbury Manor, and Matilda now demanded the territory. Using her influence, she even managed to harry the county of Gloucestershire, depriving the main town of its royal charter. Her wrath knew no bounds, as Matilda now used all of her propaganda to turn her husband against the man. William, as always, acted on impulse, and acted swiftly. He had Brithric arrested, and without trial, slung him in a prison. An awful miscarriage of justice, even for the era. He would die 2 years later. The rumour was that Matilda had ordered him assassinated. What a moo! But even if she didn't have him imprisoned or killed, she certainly inherited most of his estate, as the Domesday Book attests to this. Towards the end of her life, she gave most of it away, but she still had them in the first place. Of all the lands to have acquired, she acquired his. But Brithric was supposedly at a coronation, so they must have got along. So what on earth happened? Now, Brithric did oppose William, and he was part of the Exeter Rebellion, which had drawn William to England in the first place from Normandy. This resulted in a siege, the Siege of Exeter, which the Saxons lost, so this could explain things a lot more. Also, around this time, Eadric the Wild was also rising up against the Normans. A lot was going on. Tewkesbury Manor was eventually torn down piece by piece by William Fitz-Osbern, one of William's loyal magnates. But all this occurred before the coronation. So how could he have been at the coronation if he'd been part of this rebellion? Or is that the part that's the misinformation? There is so much going on behind the scenes here that we simply do not know. So Matilda may have not been a moo after all? Maybe she can't catch a break with the rumour mill. You've seen it before. Or maybe Matilda had learnt a thing or two from Mabel of Bethune and developed a ruthless streak. It's certainly food for thought, and we already know that Matilda's no pushover. I certainly would not put it past her, upon hearing that an ex-lover was in rebellion against her husband, to seal his fate once and for all. But either way, Brithric was dead. And all in all, this isn't Matilda's most finest hour, because slowly the Saxon women are being replaced. Many are fleeing to Flanders, leaving the gap open for the Norman women. Matilda would also have been part of the drive to push the English language out of the higher society, in favour of French and Latin. The ruling class looking more separated from the native Saxons with each passing year. The Normans themselves are also showing their worst behaviour. They were acting like the barbarians they despised. Rape and murder were rife. It was an awful time for the Saxons, at least according to the chronicler Malmesbury. But Oderic, another chronicler, disputes this. He claims otherwise, saying it was more civil, and for the most part there was integration, so most likely it was a bit of both. Laws are slowly put into place to punish perpetrators of these hideous crimes. And slowly order was returning to the kingdom. So it wasn't all bad. Though, in the north, there was a darkness brewing. Edgar Atheling has been biding his time in Scotland, and once again he sets his eyes on the throne of England.